and Captain Robert Harding had learned to read trouble in the small noises people made when they thought no one was listening. He lifted the corner of a prisoner's mattress during routine inspection, exposed 3 blocks of bread hardened like wood and an apple core furred with grey mould, and wrote 7th incident in a clean hand on a violation form. The discovery turned a single infraction into a pattern, and the cost of noticing a pattern in a place built to punish it was that the pattern would now belong to him. Harding did not call for the guard sergeant to haul the German to confinement as procedure encouraged. He carried the mouldy pieces to a metal tray, watched a medic flinch at the sweet rot, and ordered the prisoner brought alone to the exam room instead. The choice bought him a small freedom to treat a problem as sickness rather than disobedience, and it immediately purchased suspicion from the camp's order keepers, who preferred visible discipline to invisible diagnosis. The prisoner arrived with his cap in both hands and his shoulders drawn inward as if bracing for a blow that could come from any direction. Harding introduced himself slowly, pointed to the tray, and asked in careful, learned German why the food had been hidden. The name tag read, Hans Lehmann. Yet Lehmann's eyes moved away from the tray as if it were a weapon, and he answered with nothing at all. The interview produced silence, and the cost of that silence was that Harding could not tell whether he faced language failure, willful refusal, or a mind locked in some private siege. Harding tried to make the room smaller, safer, more predictable, because frightened men needed edges they could trust. He set the tray aside, offered water, kept his voice level, and traced a small box on the tabletop with his finger as if indicating a place to store something. Lehmann watched the gesture, stared at the table's varnish, and swallowed without speaking. The effort produced no answer, and it cost Harding the last excuse to call this mere contraband. In his later notes, Harding would write that he felt, for the first time in the camp, the boundary between discipline and medicine blur into something ugly. A guard could force compliance, but he could not force a man to believe tomorrow existed. That realization produced a new kind of responsibility, and the cost was that Harding began to see every infraction as a possible symptom with a body attached to it. That afternoon, Harding opened Lehmann's personnel file, the thick brown folder that smelled of dust and stamp ink and carried the soft weight of other people's decisions. He read unit numbers, capture location, transfer notations, and the clipped phrases that turned days of fear into administrative sentences. The papers placed Lehmann with formations that had operated near Leningrad and later under brutal attrition in North Africa. The file offered Harding an origin story, and the cost was that he could no longer solve this with punishment without lying to himself. Harding copied the relevant lines into his medical log, a ledger that gave the illusion of control through dates and columns. He recorded the items found, their condition, the prisoner's non-response, and a note that the behaviour suggested trauma rather than theft. The act of writing produced a framework he could defend later, and it cost him time and focus that other patients and other duties would not stop demanding. The next morning, Harding requested a translator, and the request itself created a new kind of visibility. Esther Green arrived in a pressed uniform with a clipboard, fluent German shaped by immigrant parents and army training, and she asked what Harding expected. Harding explained the facts, asked her to keep her manner neutral, and brought Lehmann back in. The translator gave Harding a second set of ears, and it cost Lehmann the privacy of being able to hide behind misunderstanding. Green asked Lehmann the same questions Harding had asked. Lehmann kept his eyes averted, his jaw tight, his hands clenched around his cap, and he answered with the same refusal. Nothing. Harding watched the tension in Lehmann's knuckles and the way his breathing sped up when the tray came into view, then wrote it down like a symptom. The result was still silence, and the cost was Harding's growing certainty that ordinary persuasion would not reach this man. Because the camp allowed only a narrow lane for compassion, Harding tried an experiment that could be defended as procedure. He arranged for Lehmann to work light duty in the kitchen, a controlled exposure to abundance, reasoning that regular contact with steady supply might teach the body what the mind refused to believe. The plan placed Lehmann where food was visible and counted, and it cost Harding a slice of authority because he was now responsible for what that access produced. Harding observed the first shift from the doorway under the pretense of checking sanitation. Lehmann chopped vegetables without complaint, accepted instructions with stiff obedience, and never once reached openly for extra food. The appearance of compliance created a brief, dangerous optimism in Harding, and it cost him the caution that would have remembered how obedience can be camouflage when the real action happens after supervisors leave. 2 weeks later, a guard knocked on Harding's office door and held out a paper bag that sagged with weight. Inside were butter packets, a tin of luncheon meat, and a crumpled roll of coffee substitute, all discovered in Lehmann's bedding during a surprise check. The hidden stash was larger and more varied than before, and the cost of Harding's kitchen placement was now measurable in grease-stained wrappers and rising resentment from men who believed special access was being purchased behind their backs. Complaints reached the command office in the form of murmured accusations, and then a signed statement from a prisoner spokesman named Schneider. Schneider argued that Lehmann was being given privileged access while others were punished for less, and the document forced the camp to treat a psychological problem as a public fairness problem. The complaint produced pressure from above, and the cost landed on Harding's desk as an order to resolve the issue by disciplinary or medical means. Colonel Buck summoned Harding and spoke with the impatient politeness of a man managing too many moving parts. He wanted the compound quiet and the reports clean, and he asked Harding whether Lehmann was sick or merely manipulative. Harding answered that he could not yet certify a diagnosis, but could not ignore the pattern, and he requested time to gather evidence. The meeting produced a short extension, and it cost Harding a clear warning that patience would end with the next incident. Harding returned to the infirmary and chose the kind of evidence the camp respected: numbers. He brought the food purchase sheet to the exam room, a typed page filled with deliveries, quantities, and signatures, and asked Green to translate as he showed Lehmann the lines that proved steady supply. The paper made abundance visible in black ink, and it cost Harding the discomfort of using numbers as reassurance, because numbers had been used as lies in every war. Lehmann stared at the sheet longer than he had stared at any question, and a sound came out of him that was almost laughter and almost pain. He tapped the largest figures with a finger that trembled, and he said, "Leningrad also had ration sheets. The numbers were false." The sentence produced the first bridge into his inner world, and it cost Harding a brutal correction. Proof of plenty does not erase a memory of starvation, and sometimes it sharpens it. Harding ended the session without arguing and wrote in his log that numerical reassurance increases agitation. The note produced a new rule for his own practice, and it cost him the hope that he could reason Lehmann out of fear with the tools of supply and arithmetic. Harding built his days around Lehmann's behaviour, because behaviour was the only language Lehmann offered consistently. He ordered medical-noted checks of Lehmann's quarters, requested that confiscated items be delivered to the infirmary for documentation, and questioned kitchen supervisors about access points. The routines produced a map of opportunity and escalation, and the cost was that every intervention made Lehmann more watched, and being watched was one of the conditions that could turn trauma into panic. By late winter, the hidden food was not merely more frequent but more desperate in choice. Mold did not deter him, rancid fat did not deter him, and he began hiding scraps no sane man would save if tomorrow felt real. Harding examined him for fever and gut illness and found no acute disease, then warned the barracks lieutenant that spoiled hoards would become a medical outbreak if searches kept being done carelessly. The exam produced no simple answer, and the cost was the recognition that the sickness lived in expectation rather than the stomach. When spring arrived, the camp announced that butter allocation would be doubled due to local surplus, and the notice passed through the compound like weather. Men shrugged, joked, and adjusted, because a change that meant more was not a threat to most nervous systems. Harding watched Lehmann tighten at the words double allotment, saw his eyes search faces as if waiting for the trick, and wrote down the reaction. The announcement produced comfort in the group, and it cost Lehmann the thin stability he could maintain only when the rules stayed fixed. Within days, Harding's inspections uncovered a stash that bordered on absurdity. Butter wrappers were tucked into seams, softened packets were wedged behind boards, and a tin of meat had been pushed into a hollowed space beneath the bed frame like a secret weapon. Harding removed the items with a medic, placed them on his metal tray, and recorded each one while Green translated his warnings about spoilage. The result was a clean bed and a clean record, and the cost was that Lehmann's body broke in the only way it could, shoulders shaking, tears sliding down his cheeks without sound, hands clenched as if holding on to a vanishing world. Harding wrote the reaction down like vital signs, because the camp respected paper more than pain. The record produced medical necessity that could resist discipline, and the cost was that Lehmann's humanity was being turned into entries the system could file and forget. Soon after, Green brought an envelope from the censorship desk. It was a letter to Lehmann from his sister, passed through review and resealed with official tape. Harding chose to have it read in the exam room with Green translating, because refusing it would be another form of starvation. The decision produced an opening into Lehmann's current moral world, and the cost was Harding the knowledge that openings rarely come without collapse. The sister wrote of ersatz food, thin potato portions, neighbors trading anything for calories, and the fear that winter would return before supplies did. Lehmann held the paper like it might crumble and pressed it to his forehead, as if trying to absorb it through bone. The reading produced visible grief, and the cost was that the camp's abundance now looked obscene against the letter's scarcity. Harding watched Lehmann's hands as Green finished. Lehmann reached into his pocket, pulled out a strip of dried meat from that day's meal, and began to slide it into the envelope with slow, stubborn care, as if performing a sacred duty. The action produced a clear statement of motive, hoarding as an attempt to feed the absent, and the cost was that Harding had to stop him because the mail rules would seize it at the gate and punish everyone in reach. Harding placed his hand over the envelope and said quietly that it could not be sent. Green translated. Lehmann looked up as if hearing the sentence of a court, then withdrew the meat and folded it back into his pocket with the same ritual care. The intervention prevented a pointless violation, and the cost was the extinguishment in Lehmann's face when mercy met bureaucracy. That night, Harding wrote that the camp's plenty did not soothe Lehmann. It amplified imbalance, as if every extra bite was stolen from home. The note produced a shift in Harding's framework from cure to containment, and the cost was that his tools as a general physician felt suddenly small. Around the same time, Harding noticed an irregularity that did not fit the public narrative of surplus. Staff coffee grew thin, infirmary kitchen stores shrank, and search orders in the barracks increased whenever shortages were mentioned. Harding requested inventory ledgers under the pretense of dietary planning for patients and compared them to the purchase sheets he had shown Lehmann, then to the requisitions signed by the quartermaster's office. The comparison produced a pattern of small, consistent gaps, and the cost was that the gaps suggested a story the camp did not want told. Sergeant Molloy, the quartermaster non-commissioned officer, came to the infirmary with a request that sounded routine and felt sharp. He wanted Harding's signature stating that Lehmann's hoarding was habitual misconduct, language that would make confinement inevitable and make any missing supplies look solved. Molloy spoke about waste and discipline as if they were medical terms, and he implied that doctors existed to validate procedure. Harding refused to label fear as crime and asked for any future request in writing. The encounter produced a quiet threat wrapped in procedure, and the cost was Harding's certainty that Lehmann was being positioned as a convenient explanation. Harding did not accuse Molloy without proof. He tightened his own chain of custody. He required that searches involving Lehmann be reported to medical staff, logged every confiscation with time and witnesses, and began sealing evidence envelopes with his own stamp, so items could not disappear after documentation. The tightening produced defensible evidence, and the cost was friction with officers who preferred to act without oversight and resented being watched. When Schneider's complaints flared again and Buck's patience thinned, Harding met the commander and presented two linked risks. Punitive pressure was escalating Lehmann's behaviour, and supply gaps were being explained away by blaming prisoner hoarding. He did not name Molloy. He presented dates, quantities, and the timing of search orders, then asked for a quiet verification rather than a spectacle that would ignite the compound. The briefing forced Buck to choose between a convenient story and an inconvenient review, and the cost was that Harding tied his reputation to numbers the camp could choose to ignore. Buck ordered a limited verification and warned Harding to keep the matter contained. Harding left with permission but no safety, knowing that if nothing could be proved, Lehmann would be punished as an example and Harding removed as a nuisance. The result was a thin shield of authority, and the cost was sleeplessness, because every future event would now be interpreted through this gamble. 2 days later, a sealed memo arrived in Harding's in-tray, with the bland title, Supply Reconciliation. He read a list of small discrepancies, missing tins, short butter counts, requisitions signed without matching receipts, and recognized his own dates echoed back in bureaucratic language. He was ordered to submit his confiscation logs for correlation, and he complied, copying each entry before releasing the originals. The request produced the first institutional acknowledgement that something was wrong, and the cost was that Harding had to treat his own evidence like contraband, because in a camp, paper could vanish as easily as food. Buck called him in after sunset, away from the day's noise. The commander did not admit wrongdoing, but he said the quartermaster office would be reassigned and that searches would be reduced to prevent unnecessary agitation. Harding understood the translation. The camp would fix the leak without announcing it, and Molloy would be removed without being named a thief. The conversation produced a partial victory that protected Lehmann from being used as an explanation, and the cost was that truth would be repaired the way infrastructure is repaired, quietly, with no accountability, and with everyone instructed to forget the crack existed. In May 1945, loudspeakers crackled with the news of Germany's surrender, and the compound erupted in a confusion of cheers, sobs, and curses. Harding watched meals distributed in a mood that was half celebration and half reckoning, then saw Lehmann's face go blank, as if the word end had cut a final thread. The announcement produced communal release, and it cost Lehmann whatever structure had kept him moving. At the table, Lehmann did not pocket food, did not eat, did not even lift his utensils. Harding spoke his name and touched his shoulder lightly. Lehmann's eyes did not track. The scene inverted everything Harding had been treating. Abundance now produced paralysis, and the cost was a medical emergency, because refusal in that state meant dehydration and collapse. Harding ordered Lehmann transferred to the infirmary and argued down a lieutenant who wanted to handle it as insubordination. He invoked medical authority and accepted the hostile stares that came with it. The move produced a protected space for crisis response, and the cost was open conflict with the camp's punitive reflex at the very moment the camp was most emotionally volatile. On the infirmary cot, Lehmann lay stiff as a plank, his eyelids fluttering without focusing, his mouth dry, his pulse fast but thready. Harding tried gentle stimulation, cool water on the lips, the steady call of his name, green translating reassurance, and watched for any sign of return. The attempts produced only fragments, a whispered blend of German and Russian, words like snow, rats, ration, gone, spoken as if from a far tunnel. The fragments offered Harding confirmation of the siege inside Lehmann, and the cost was that confirmation did not supply a cure. Harding understood the mechanism. Surrender had not freed Lehmann, but stripped him of the logic that had sustained him. The war had provided an explanation for hunger, and now hunger remained without explanation. He faced a choice the camp hated to admit: force food into a body that would read force as attack, or risk a gentler method and accept accountability for whatever followed. The decision produced a new kind of courage, and the cost was that courage could be mistaken for negligence by men hungry for a clean solution. Harding refused forced feeding as a first move. He dismissed the guard from the doorway, asked Green to step back, placed a small piece of bread in Lehmann's palm, and closed his own hand over it without speech. The action offered food without punishment, and the cost was that Harding had no guarantee the body would accept the offer before organs began to fail. Minutes passed with only the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of the camp outside trying to celebrate an ending it did not understand. Lehmann's fingers twitched, then curled, gripping the bread with weak insistence that looked like instinct rather than decision. The result was the smallest measurable return to life, and the cost was Harding's next truth. Saving a man from dying did not mean saving him from what war had built inside him. By evening, Lehmann's eyes opened fully, and his gaze settled on Harding with the exhausted clarity of someone surfacing from deep water. Harding offered sips of water, watched him swallow, and signaled for Green only when breathing steadied. The recovery produced relief in the room, and the cost came immediately because Lehmann's first words were not about surrender or freedom, but a simple question: "Where is my bread?" Harding answered carefully, because any careless answer could become a trigger. He told Lehmann the bread in his hand was his, that more food would come, and that no one would take it from him in that moment. Lehmann nodded once, but his eyes moved past Harding toward the door, as if expecting someone to enter and revoke the promise. The exchange produced a return of consciousness, and the cost was that it also proved the central structure remained intact. Safety had to be held, not explained. Harding documented the crisis and the response with the same precision he used for fevers and fractures, because the camp respected paper more than pain. He wrote that Lehmann had entered a stuporous state after the surrender announcement, had refused food and water, and had responded to minimal contact without restraint. The report produced a defensible narrative for command, and the cost was that a human collapse became a paragraph. In the days that followed, Harding shifted from trying to eliminate hoarding to trying to prevent it from killing Lehmann or igniting the compound. He arranged observed meals, allowed Lehmann a small permitted reserve of bread in a sealed tin for medical reassurance, and required that any additional hidden food be removed immediately for hygiene. The plan produced a fragile stability, and the cost was political. Schneider called it favoritism, staff called it softness, and Lehmann called it nothing at all. Harding met Schneider with Green translating and explained that the reserve tin was a medical safety valve, not a reward, and that it reduced the need for more dangerous hiding. Schneider agreed to damp down harassment if portions stayed equal. The conversation produced a temporary truce, and the cost was that Harding had to spend social capital managing men's perceptions when he would rather spend it managing one patient's fear. The verification of supply gaps concluded quietly. Buck informed Harding that procedural corrections were being made in the supply chain and that searches would return to normal frequency. Molly was transferred out within a week on paper terms that sounded neutral, and no one announced an investigation to the prisoners because announcing would admit vulnerability. The result was that the scapegoat plan lost its chosen target, and the cost was that the truth remained half-buried, known only through the sudden easing of pressure. Harding completed a final internal note for the medical file, that the camp's sudden abundance had not corrected the prisoner's fear, and that punitive pressure reliably worsened it. He attached copies of his logs, the purchase sheet he had once used as reassurance, and Green's translated summary of the sister's letter, because he had begun to believe the only honest treatment was to preserve the record. The package produced an archive the camp could not easily erase, and the cost was Harding's admission that his work here was becoming less about cure and more about testimony. Years later, he would write a single line beneath the anonymized initials HL. Some injuries, forged by deprivation and terror, can be wrapped by abundance and kindness, but they do not close. The sentence produced the closest thing to a professional conclusion, and the cost was that it sounded like a verdict on the limits of medicine. As summer approached, repatriation lists were posted, and the camp's mood shifted from wartime holding to post-war sorting. Harding received paperwork placing Lehmann on an early transport, and he was required to complete a final medical assessment stating whether the prisoner could travel. He checked weight, hydration, and stability, and noted that the acute crisis had resolved, but the compulsive behaviour persisted. The assessment produced permission for departure, and the cost was a sharp awareness that Harding's management would end at the gate, while Lehmann's fear would not. On the eve of departure, Harding arranged a controlled meal for Lehmann in the infirmary. Nothing extravagant, just a plate that looked abundant in a way the barracks could not supervise. He sat across from Lehmann with few words. Lehmann ate slowly, chewing as if each bite required negotiation with old ghosts, and he finished the plate without hiding food in his sleeves. The meal produced a moment that could be mistaken for recovery, and the cost of mistaking it would have been heartbreak, because Harding had learned to watch the last gesture, not the first. When Lehmann pushed the empty plate away, he lifted the cloth napkin, folded it into a neat rectangle with absurd care, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, as if securing a treasure. Harding recognized the old ritual wearing a new disguise, and felt the last layer of optimism peel away. The gesture produced the story's clearest symbol. Clean cloth still became something to store against hunger, and the cost was that Harding could no longer tell himself that time in a place of plenty had rebuilt what the siege had broken. At the assembly point, the next morning, Harding stood at the edge of the crowd, officially there for medical oversight, and unofficially there because leaving without seeing the ending would feel like abandonment. Lehmann adjusted his bag, kept one hand near his pocket as if checking the napkin's presence, and looked back once. He searched for words, found only the broken English he had picked up, and said, "Doctor, here, good." The sentence produced gratitude and judgment at once, and the cost was that Harding could not argue with either. Lehmann turned and joined the line, swallowed by uniforms and dust and the logistics of peace, and Harding returned to the infirmary with paperwork still in his hands. He filed the final assessment, closed the case folder, and felt the emptiness that follows a long struggle when it ends without resolution. The action produced administrative closure, and the cost was an internal openness that would not close, a sense that medicine had been used to keep a wound clean without being able to knit it. Years later, after the war had rearranged the country into a new normal, Harding sat in a university library with the calm title of professor and the uneasy habit of listening for trouble in quiet noises. He reviewed a paper he had published on war injury, and his finger paused on a paragraph labeled Patient HL, because anonymity was the price of turning a human being into scholarship. The text described compulsive hoarding in abundance, stupor after the loss of wartime purpose, and the partial success of minimal contact interventions. The reading produced professional distance, and the cost was that distance never held for long, because the memory of Lehmann's hands shaking over a napkin still arrived with physical force. A decade after repatriation, Harding requested follow-up through a veterans research network and received a thin summary from overseas medical correspondents. A man matching HL's profile had been repeatedly hospitalized for hoarding and malnutrition in a shattered post-war economy. The document offered no comfort and no ending, only another ledger entry that sounded like his old camp log. The follow-up produced confirmation that the pattern had survived the wire, and the cost was Harding's realization that he had been treating a symptom of war that peace did not automatically reverse. Harding closed the journal and looked out at a city where food sat behind glass and people argued over trivial shortages, as if history had never taught them what empty means. He understood the dark truth of the case. Hunger forged into the nervous system by terror can survive the arrival of plenty, and even be sharpened by it, because plenty proves how late rescue can arrive. The conclusion produced the only honest ending he could write, and the cost was the question he could never treat. How many people walk through peace still arranged for siege?